Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Lamed Gimel. Today's Daf is sponsored by Sagi Carmel in honor of Ashley Offenheim on their marriage today. Mazal tov. Another announcement, as I mentioned last week, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to have our Siyum in a week. The Siyum will be next Sunday, October 10th, I think is the date, and it will be at 7 o'clock Israel time, 7 p.m., so whatever time that is by you. And registration will open hopefully later today. Everything will go out. People can register. We're going to have back to in-person Siyumim, and that will be on Sunday, Bezrat Hashem. And then we will start Masechet Rosh Hashanah. So that means no regular class on Sunday. On Sunday, we'll learn at the Siyum the last daf, and then regular classes will resume on Monday morning. Okay, and then we have month, basically Siyums once every month, short Masechtot coming up. So good time to get other friends to join. If you have friends who are thinking about it, and I'm just reminding you, if you have people who it's relevant for, we're starting a new series in Hebrew, specifically targeted at young women, ages 19 to 35. So if you know people, the details are on the Hebrew side of our site. You can find them there. Okay, we're going to start now with the bottom of Lamed Bet Amud Bet. I'll repeat the last line because the last line connects with what we're learning today, or at least the very beginning. Amar Rav Yehuda, Hai Medorta, Milamala Lamata Share, Milamata Lamala Asur. This is when you're building a midura, a bonfire, right? We said you can't build it from bottom up the way you normally do. You have to build it from top down. How on earth do that? One person holds the top part and the other people bring in, right? You hold the beams at the top and the other people bring in the base. They stick the base in and kind of the top piece is already there in midair and it's in its place. So it sounds like this is because you're doing it with the shinoi, some sort of change. On the other hand, some people explain that this just isn't called boning. Nobody builds a house by putting the roof and then the walls. So it's just not considered the action of building if you do it in this manner. And likewise, eggs. What does this have to do with eggs? So different opinions among the Mefarshim, because what does eggs have to do with building? Rashi explains we're talking about beitzim gasot hanitunot al pi kli chalul ke'ein tripod or ala askala. It's like putting them on some sort of tripod type thing. If you're putting eggs on this tripod to cook on. So they say normally you would put the kli on top and then you would cook the eggs. This sounds a lot like the case with the two barrels and the fire underneath, and then you put the pot. Normally you put the pot and you put the eggs in. So they say this time you put, and then you would put the, right, so first you would put the, right, instead, what do? You put the egg into the frying pan and then put the frying pan on the fire. And then it's also done a little bit different. V'chein gedera, also a pot. So here they say this is like the pot on top of the two barrels, right? So again, what do? You bring the pot and then you put the barrels underneath the pot. V'chein pulia, likewise a bed. So their beds were made of like a piece of leather that went over a base, and it was attached to the base with loops, like there were these, hooks, and then they would loop into the leather piece had loops on it. They would loop into the base, and then you would put up legs. So normally, what would you do? You build the legs, you build the base, you put the leather piece on top and strap it in, loop it in. So then what do you do instead? You take the loops, right? The leather, you kind of have someone holding it. You have someone bring the base. They put the loops onto the base and then they put the legs up. And again, that's the reverse order that would work. V'chein chavita, and likewise a chavit. What does this mean? Because we already talked about the chaviyot, but this is different. This is when you want to arrange them in your storage area, one on top of the other. So again, you have to have someone hold the barrel at the top and then someone put the barrel in on the bottom. Next case. In the Mishnah, it had said, if you have a pot that's a little bit lopsided, not straight, you can't fix it using a piece of wood to kind of prop it up. What is this v'chein bedelet? It sounds like it's saying, and also you can't use a door to prop it up. Why does it sound like that's what it means? Because it says, don't somech v'kdera with a bikat, v'chein bidelet, and also with a delet. So the Gemara says, bidelet zal kadatach? How could you possibly prop up a pot that's lopsided using a door? It's not really logical. So ela ema v'chein hadelet. Oh no. The delet is giving you another example. You can't be somech l'ktera with a bikat, with a chip of wood, or a delet with a chip of wood, right? I'm thinking of like a door stopper or something to make the door more straight. You can't do that. So we don't yet know why this is. So we're going to see in a minute. And this is the basis of a lot of our sugyot today. So Tana Rabbanan, they now bring a Beitzah, which number one has the exact yirsa that we just fixed. That should be hadelet instead of bidelet. And it explains why. So Tana Rabbanan, ein somchim et haktera bivik'at v'chein hadelet. Lefisha lo ni'nu etzim ela lahasaka. What's the reason? Because wood, this is a very interesting thing. Wood is meant specifically, what purpose does wood have on Yantif? For burning. That's it then. It's only permitted for burning. For any other thing, it would be considered muktzah. And therefore, it comes to the next line, Rabbi Shimon matil, Rabbi Shimon, who's always mekel, lenient when it comes to muktzah, he's very lenient, doesn't think this is a muktzah problem. Now let's just talk for a minute about this muktzah problem. Something seemingly very strange. So there's two ways that the Mefarshim understand this. One is to say that the wood is not muktzah for the purposes of cooking, right? Because that's something that's permitted on Yantif, but they are muktzah for everything else. So they're permitted for that, but they're muktzah for everything else. Now, this is a little bit strange because this sounds a lot like Rabbi Nehemiah's approach that we saw yesterday. We don't hold like it, where he says, Ein kli nital ela l'tzorech tashmisho, right? For its usual use. So you could say the usual use of wood on Yantif is burning. So therefore, we're going to permit it for burning, but we're not going to permit it for anything else. But that's somewhat antithetical to what we've learned about muktzah. Once something has a purpose on this day, usually you are allowed to use it for other things, right? Again, not forbidden things, but permitted things. So it's a little bit of a difficult explanation. There are others who come and explain it in a different way, which is that really, it's not that they're not muktzah. They're muktzah for everything. It's just that the rabbis came and said, even though they're muktzah, we're going to allow you to use them on Yantif. But then we're only allowing you for the purposes of hasaka, for burning, for making a fire, but not for any other reason. So instead of saying they're not muktzah for that, and they are muktzah, right, but we're going to say they're muktzah because, right, the first explanation, what we're really saying is they're really muktzah. Entirely. It's just that we're going to permit use of them for the purposes of lighting for making a fire, because otherwise, how are you going to make a fire on Yantif? And we know you're allowed to do that in order to cook. Again, we'll talk about what does it mean make a fire, transferring from another existing fire. That's going to come up in the Mishnah later on this Amud, on this page. But in general, right, that's what I mean when I say make a fire, not from scratch. But the point is that they basically just overrode muktzah for that purpose. But that makes sense. Then it's remains muktzah otherwise, right? It's muktzah for any other purpose. Because really, wood is generally muktzah. It's just for Yantif, we're going to permit it for burning. So that's like a different way of understanding it, which makes a lot more sense with the way we understand the way muktzah works. Next line in the Mishnah. Ve'ein manhigin, as we're going back to the Mishnah, explaining the different cases. Ein manhigim et habehema b'makel b'yom tov. You can't lead an animal with a stick on Yantif. V'Rabbi Elazar v'Rabbi Shimon matil. So he permits. Now remember, this is Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He's the same Rabbi Shimon who was Mekel in Muktzah. So the Gemara says, Lema Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon kavu aspir alei deleit le Muktzah. Why does he allow leading an animal with a stick? Is it because he holds the stick isn't Muktzah because he holds by Rabbi Shimon, by his father, who's very lenient in Dinei Muktzah and holds, right, wood can be used for any purpose because it's not Muktzah, even though Tanakama said it is. So they say, lo, you don't necessarily need to say that. There's a different issue here at stake. And he's incredibly lenient, but even Rabbi Shimon would forbid leading an animal with a stick. Why is that? Mishum demechse, lo, baha afilu Rabbi Shimon modeh. On this issue, even Rabbi Shimon would agree. Mishum demechse kemanda azil lechinga. When you lead an animal with a stick, it looks like you're leading an animal to the shuk. And the shuk, leading animals to the shuk, is something that generally people did on a weekday. And it looks like, even though we did say you're allowed to sell your animals on Yantif, but I think this idea of leading your animals to the shuk is what we call an uvdin dechol, something that one would normally do on a weekday, we wouldn't allow this kind of thing on Yantif. So this whole separate reason why this is forbidden, not necessarily because of muktzah only. Okay, maybe it's also muktzah, but it's also got this additional issue. And therefore, even Rabbi Yishima, who wouldn't think this is a muktzah issue, would also forbid this. Chizra. Now we get to a different thing, which is, until now we were talking about using wood, not for purposes of kindling, right? For some other purpose entirely, straightening up your pot, right? Doing something else. What about using it as a skewer? Now, a skewer, it's true, you're not using it to make a fire, but you are using it in the fire as part of your cooking utensils. So how do we view that? Rav Nachman asal v'Rav Sheshet shalei. Another machloket. Okay, Rav Nachman says no way. Rav Sheshet says yes, you can. So now there's a debate about what the debate is and in which case do they debate. And in other words, when I said what the debate is, really what I mean is what's the root of the debate between them? What does each one hold? And therefore, in which case would it be a problem? In which case would they agree? So we have dry and moist. So let's start. Biritiva. In a moist one, everyone agrees that a moist one is forbidden because moist wood is not usable for a fire at all. So therefore, you can't even use it for a skewer because you can't even use it for your fire. The machloket is if it's dry. So you would simply say, like we said before, wood is only for kindling. This is not kindling. This is to hold your food in the fire, but it's not kindling. And the one who permits, what's the difference? To roast on it, it itself becomes the coal, or to roast with it, right? In other words, to roast it on a coal with using this skewer. In other words, it's basically one and the same because you're using it in the fire to roast the food. So he views it as all one and the same, and therefore kindling would include this as well. That's the first way of reading it. So then the debate is only about dry. Some people say, everyone agrees that if it's dry, since you can use it for kindling, you can obviously use it as your skewer. And on that, there's no debate. The debate doesn't have to do with this whole thing of lo nitna etzim ela lahasaka. This comes under the rubric of hasaka, of kindling. Ki pligi b'retivta. The machloket is about moist ones. Manda asal de lo chaze lahasaka. The one who says no, Rav Nachman, he says it's because you can't use it for kindling because it's wet, it's moist. So therefore, you can't also use it for a skewer, right? We're only going to allow for a skewer what you could use for kindling. Uman deshale amar lecha. What do you mean it's not ra'oi for kindling? Hachaze lehasek gadol. We actually saw this earlier in the Masechet, that even if it's moist, if you were to put it into a big fire that you had going, it would dry within a minute or two because the fire is so strong, and then it would turn into a coal. So you could use it actually for kindling. So there's a debate about whether a moist one is usable enough for kindling, or do we go by a normal oven in which it won't really do much, or can we say, since you can put it into a big fire, you can actually do it. And what's the halacha? The halacha is that dry, you can use it as a skewer, moist, you cannot, which actually matches, we'll go through it, it matches either Rav Sheshet according to the first girsa or Rav Nachman according to the second. It's all charted out on the sheet, so you can see it a little more easily there. Darish Rav. Rava now made the following halacha. He basically said, this is the law in a particular case. Isha, a woman, now we're going to see this isn't just a woman, okay? There's a lot of cases where the Gemara, not so many, but there's a bunch where they use cases specifically and they word it with women. It's likely because that was actions that women generally did. So therefore, they're talking in the form of a woman shouldn't do this, not that a man can. Of course, a man can't as well. But they wanted to give real life examples. So they said, since women generally do this, a woman should not do the following. It gives us a little bit of insight anytime they have these things into what activities were common for women to do and what activities were less common for women to do. So Isha lo tikanes ledir ha'itzim litol mehen ud. We already said that the wood is generally meant for kindling. So if you want to go into your storage house of wood, you're allowed to go in. Okay, it seems clear here the women were the ones doing this. You can go in to take firewood, but you can't go in to take a stick to stoke the coals with. That's an oud. Okay, it's an implement that they would use to stoke the coals. That's not lahasaka. It's true, it's helping lahasaka, but it's not lahasaka. And what you're basically doing is you're kind of creating You're saying, I'm turning this into a kli for this. You're creating a utensil out of it. Whereas wood, lahasaka, is not really a utensil or anything. Here you're saying, I want to use this as a utensil. So you're turning it into something else. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat or on Yantif, right? Obviously not on Shabbat where you can't even kindle. Forget about that, right? We're talking Yantif. So, but then they say, ud shenishbal. What if you had an ud that if you designated it before Yantif, then of course you could use it as an ud. You basically designated this will be an implement I'm going to use when I'm cooking. That's fine. But you can't take it from the storage house and call it an ud when it was really meant for kindling. Again, this is all about designation and what you designated before what you did. What if you have something that was an ud? You designated it from before, but nishbal, it broke on Yantif. So now, asur lahasiko b'yom tov. You can't now use this in your fire. Right now, it can't be an ud, but you could use it as firewood. But they say, no, you can't. Why? This goes back to what we saw yesterday. Remember, we saw 3 brightot, what you could use for kindling, either it has to be a kli, or it could be even a broken kli. That was Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda said it has to be a kli, but not a broken kli. You can't use something that was broken. And Rabbi Nechemia said you can't use a kli or a broken kli because that's not what it was designated for, right? So now they say, while the oud was whole and intact, you could have used it for kindling. But now it became a broken kli. That's something that we call it was almost nolad today. It was born today. This is a little strange to think of a broken kli as something that was born. And there's actually some different approaches about it. Is it real nolad? Is it just kind of like nolad? Because what do you mean? A broken kli was a kli. It's just a broken kli now. How do you view as a broken kli like a kli but broken? Or is it something totally different? And generally in halacha, they view it as something entirely different. So the broken kli is basically something that was created today. You can't use that for kindling. Right? And that's Rabbi Yehuda basically, right? Because you can use a kli, a vessel, and to use for fire, but you can't use something that was broken on Yantif. So now they say, wait a minute. According to this, right? This is clear. Seems like Rava, who said this, must be holding like Rabbi Yehuda because he's quoting exactly the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Right? But that's a problem because we're going to see something that Rava did that seems to go against Rabbi Yehuda. He said to his shamash, his steward, Tvei bar avza, roast for me a duck, v'shdei me'eha l'shunra, or a goose. I always get confused with all my animals. U'shdei me'eh l'shunra, and throw the innards to the cat. Now, how can you throw the innards to the cat? What was this avaz ready for when Yantif started? For you, right? What do you have in mind? That I might slaughter this on Yantif. So you're allowed to slaughter it, but how can you give the innards, the part that's inedible, to the cat? You certainly weren't thinking about the cat. By the way, shunra, how do you know it's cat? It comes up in Chagadya, if you remember, right? Biyata shunra. So how could you possibly give it to a cat? It wasn't ra'oi. So what do you see here? It's like a shever kli, right? It wasn't really designated for it, right? You're now creating almost something new. And Rabbi Shimon would be the only one who would say that's okay, not Rabbi Yehuda. So how could you possibly say the Rava in our case holds like Rabbi Yehuda, and here he held like Rabbi Shimon? So the answer there, no, you misunderstood that case with the Shunra. Since you knew, and what did you know when you thought about this duck or goose that you were going to slaughter? You knew that you were going to end up with these innards, and that you thought about the whole thing. You didn't just think about, okay, I want to eat, but you thought about the fact before Yantif that I'll eat the meat and I'll give the innards, which are not edible, I'll give those to the cat. Because again, what's going to happen? I can't leave them till tomorrow. They'll rot. No refrigerator, no freezer. So obviously before Yantif, you were already thinking about the cat as well. And therefore, even Rabbi Yehuda would say it's okay, because that's a level Rabbi Yehuda's fine. As long as you had in mind the cat before it, then it's fine. So you must have had the cat in mind. And therefore, we can still say that Rava holds like Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to muktzah. New Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, notel adam kesam mishelefanav lachtzotz bo shina. If you have straw in front of you in your house, and you have a little piece of straw that you want to use as dental floss, okay, you can use that, no problem. Umegabev min hachatzer umadlik. You can also gather straw from your courtyard, okay, not only from your house, also from your courtyard. Umadlik, to make a fire out of it. Why? Shekoma shebachatzer muchanu. We assume that you already had in mind before Yantif, that anything I might take to kindle straw from my courtyard. The Chachamim Omrim, they disagree with him on two counts. Number one, they don't mention anything about the kesam. They don't think that you could take a piece of straw from your house and use it as dental floss, okay? And why is that? Because straw and all that is only designated for kindling, right? Not for anything else. And when it comes to gathering, how do I know they disagree with him? Because they don't make mention of this at all. So it seems like they disagree, and Rashi also understands the Mishnah this way. And they say, Megabev mishalafanavu madlik. You can only collect the straw from your house. Mishalafanav means your house, but not your courtyard. You can't take stuff from your courtyard. So what does Rashi explain there? He says you can't take from your courtyard. I'm looking in Rashi, toward the bottom of the page. Not from the courtyard. Why? Because they're very thin. They're like little pieces. It's a pain in the neck to start gathering these slivers. So we can assume that you didn't intend to ever gather these slivers. That's not on Yantif because it's a headache. Imagine trying to gather up little slivers of straw. Take forever, right? That start falling out and be a pain. So you all obviously weren't intending on Yantif to do this because it's just too much of a pain, right? On Yantif, it's true. You might do some labors that are related to kindling, but you're going to make things easier for yourself. You're not going to do things that are difficult. So therefore, the assumption is that you weren't thinking about it from yesterday, right? When Yantif started. Second part of this mission has to do with lighting a fire. You can't create a fire not from, right? These are all going to be flammable materials that one theoretically can make a fire from, not from wood, not from raw stones, not from the ground, from dirt, which you could theoretically make a fire out of. Lomina rafim, not from the tiles in the roof that theoretically you could heat up till the point where they could actually create a fire. You could put if you get it really hot, you could put little slivers near it and it will catch on fire. Velomina mayim, and not from water. It's very interesting, Rashi here. I'll read it with you. What does it mean from water? How do you make fire from water? So Rashi explains. If you look toward the bottom of Rashi, the bottom of the page, you put water in a white glass bowl or utensil. You put it in a very hot sun. And what happens? The glass heats up so much that it almost like a flame comes out of it. Then you put neoret, you bring little slivers or twigs and you put them next to it. They touch it. Okay, that's not the interesting part of Rashi. There he just explains what it is. How does Rashi know that you could do this? You might think maybe you saw someone do this once. No, Rashi tells you, here's my proof. It's an interesting proof. He says, in Lombardia, I saw one of the Gaonim wrote this piyut. I have this piyut, the piyut hayotzer, the ones that they would add in Shema. Okay, most people don't do this anymore. Sometimes I once ended up in a shul where they did this, where even, right, we always add piyutim in the davening on Yomim Noraim in Shmona Esrei and the Chazarat Hashatz when the Shliach Tzibor repeats it. So we have all these extra piyutim. So he had, right, the other people added also in Yotzel or Varei Choshech, all that in Shema. So he says basically that he said there was a piyut Yotzer where he described this process. So now I know that this exists because I read it in a piyut. Interesting way of learning about reality. Okay, right? Sometimes we learn things from the Gemara that we didn't know existed. So it makes sense. Last thing in the Mishnah, you can't heat up the rafim to roast, like let's say you heat up, they get so hot that you could actually roast food on it. That you also can't do. So we're going to see all this in the Gemara, why this is and all that. We'll get to it later. Right, so this is the basic law. Before we get to that last thing about rafim, this is the basic law that you can't light a fire from a match on Yantif, but you have to transfer it from a pre-existing. Okay, we're going to see why in the Gemara, even though they're not going to give us too much explanation there, but we'll see when we get to the end of today's daf. So the first thing we have is Amar Rav Yehuda. If you have animal fodder, anything that animals eat the assumption here, I think, is that it's soft. And therefore, if you make something out of it, like let's say something to floss your teeth with, that's not considered that you've created something new. Okay. You haven't created anything new because it's flimsy. Because flimsy, it's not considered significant. So Eitivei Rav Kahana l'Rav Yehuda. Rav Kahana now brings a question on him from a Beitzah. Mitaltalin atzei b'samim l'hariach behem ulanif behem l'choleh. You can take twigs with, right, that are, they have a scent to them from b'samim, okay, in order to smell, in order to wave them, to use them as a fan for someone sick, okay, because you take a branch and you can fan someone with it. Well, it wouldn't be the best fan, but it would be something. I guess if it has leaves on it, then I guess theoretically you could fan someone with the leaves. And remember, milila, you could take it between your fingers, right? Kind of rub it, and that will take the smell out of it. That's all permitted. What can't you do? Lo yiktimenu lahariachbo. You can't cut off the tip of it in order to bring out a stronger smell. We'll see why in a minute. If you did it, you're exempt, but it's forbidden. That's a general lingo. If you learn Masechet Shabbat, you know it means asur midrabanan. Right? That's basically saying the rabbis decreed it's forbidden, even though by Torah law, it's actually not forbidden. We'll see in a minute why it's forbidden by rabbinic law. If you cut this twig in order to use it as dental floss to clean out your teeth, lo yiktimenu, in order to create, right, you want to create this implement to floss your teeth and you cut it. Therefore, we're obviously talking about a branch that was already cut off the tree. If it wasn't cut from the tree, for sure you can't cut it. That's kotzer. That's in malacha. Nobody thinks you can do that. But what we're talking about is once it's already cut and you have a big piece, can you cut it more, right, to take out the smell or like that, or to create a kind of toothpick for dental floss? So you can't do it. And if you did, you'd be liable to bring a korban chatat on Shabbat. This is a Shabbat-related issue. Also, it would be the same on Yantif, but you can't do it on Shabbat, mid'oraita. That's forbidden, okay? So now, they say, if that's the case, how could Rabbi Yehuda have said that ma'achal behema isn't mishum tikun kli? Because here you could take this aseh b'samim, which theoretically we are assuming is like animal fodder, and you can't cut it to make a utensil, this toothpick for flossing your teeth. So how could that be? To which Rabbi Yehuda responds by saying the following. Basically puts up his hand and says, you got me. Okay, but he says in a very strong way. He says, Amalei, hashja. Now remember, according to the Beitzah here, it's forbidden by Torah law. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's permitted entirely. That's two jumps, right? It's saying not only is it not forbidden by rabbinic law, it's actually forbidden by Torah law. So comes Rabbi Yehuda and he says, wow, if you brought me a source that said it would be asur d'Rabbanan, it would be a problem for what I said. Asur by rabbinic, forbidden by rabbinic law. But you're telling me this is forbidden mid'oraita? Oh my God, I really messed up, right? I clearly am wrong. However, the Gemara brings an answer to Rabbi Yehuda and says, Ela kitanya hi bekashin. They say, don't worry. Rabbi Yehuda was talking about machal behema, which is soft and flimsy, and therefore it's not tikkun kli. But the Beitzah, when it was talking about these atzei b'samim, we're talking about hard branches, and therefore it's not a question. So now the Gemara says, wait, you want to say that it's talking about hard branches? How could the Beitzah possibly be talking about hard branches? Read what it says. Kashin. What is milila? Milila is when you take your fingers and very easily, you kind of rub it and it starts breaking apart. And that brings out the beautiful smell. But if it's hard, you can't do that. So how could you possibly say it's talking about something that's hard? So the answer the Gemara gives is, there's different levels here. There's different parts. Starts off by talking about hard, by soft, and then it moves to hard, and the part where it contradicted what Rabbi Yehuda said was talking about hard. So here we have it. Let's read. Okay, they skip the beginning. Right? So you can carry them. They're not muktzah in order to smell, if you need them for the smell, or, to fan a sick person. And even, here they add a line, And you can even you can even cut it, because you can cut it there, because we're not worried that you're going to cut it to make a utensil because it's soft. So we're not worried about making utensils when it's soft. But this is only if they're soft. Here come all the added words. Remember, means there's words missing in this Beitzah, and here's, right, we're going to add a transition in there. And then the Molilo was talking about something soft. But the second part that basically we're going to say didn't contradict Rav Yehuda was because the second part was talking about hard and Rav Yehuda was talking about soft. But you can't cut if it's hard. And if you did, it would only, right, it would be usher by rabbinic law. And and it would be, right, asur midoraita if you did it to create a kli. So again, no contradiction. That's all. Hard wood, right, a hard branch, which would then be a problem because it would be more permanent, as opposed to a soft one, which would be permitted. Now they say, okay, so let's show you another case where we can make this distinction. Tanechada, there's one Beitzah that says kotmo miriachbo. Again, we're talking about atzei b'samim. You can cut and smell. V'tanya idach lo yiktemenu la riachbo. And another one says you're not allowed to cut it to smell. So again, what's the answer? Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav Chisda, lo kasha barakin habakashim. Same exact answer as before. It's just we brought two different sources to say there's contradiction. One says it's okay, one says it's not. Oh, one must be talking about soft. Soft is okay, hard is not. But when he said this, Matkifla Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov comes and attacks him and says, wait a minute. Bikashina Milo. Why are kashin a problem? Right? We didn't really discuss this. Why would it be a problem? Basically, the assumption is you can't cut a branch to smell it, even though theoretically that's allowed by Torah law. But if we allow you to cut a branch to smell it, you might come, right? This is what we call a gzeira de Rabbanan. The rabbi said, don't do it, because if we allow you to do this, you might come to cut it to make a toothpick out of it. And that's a problem. So now he says the following. How is this different from what it says in a Mishnah Masechet Shabbat? Okay, he's going to ask two questions. Titnan, shover adam et hachavit le'echol mimena grogrot, ubevad shelo yitkaven la'asot kli. You can break a barrel to get to the fruit inside, as long as when you break it, this is all the sugya, and this is a very famous sugya, and what we're going to learn right now is very, very relevant. It's a famous sugya because why? This is about, can you open packages on Shabbos? Okay, there's a Shabbos issue. You're allowed to break open a barrel in order to get to the contents inside, as long as you're not creating a kli out of it, right? So this would be a problem if there was something that wasn't a kli before, and when you open it, you basically turn it into a kli. So as long as you're not intending to turn it into a kli, it's okay. So what's his question? His question is, what would you say? According to what you just said, that there's a gzera on kashin, that don't cut them to be able to smell from them, which is actually permitted, because you might then cut them to make a utensil. Now, if here they're telling you, you can break open a barrel to get the food, as long as you're not intending to create a vessel out of it, right? That you're not opening it for the purposes of making a new kli. Well, then why don't we say, since you might open it to make a kli, therefore we don't allow you to open it to get the food out. It would be the exact same zera. If it's forbidden to make a kli out of something, then it should be forbidden to cut it, not for the purposes, or break it in this case, not for the purposes of making a kli, because maybe you will then make a kli. So if you were to compare these two, it would seem that you have a contradiction here. Ve'od. And furthermore, not just am I going to question you from a Mishnah, I'm going to question you from an action that I saw someone do, or the people said someone did. Okay, the two sons of Bar Ada, interesting, he called one son Rava and one son Ravin, a little bit confusing. Both of them said, when we would go to Rav Yehuda's house, he would take branches and he would cut off strips and give us big twigs here, okay, sticks. For, right, why would he give them to them? I forget why they had them, but he would basically give them these. I'm trying to see what it is. Yeah. I don't know why he would give them to them, but he would give out these twigs, I guess for whatever purpose they had to use them for. Okay. And even though they were hard, strong sticks that could be used as a handle for a utensil, like for an axe or something like that. So here you see that it's kashim that he cut, even though theoretically you can make a utensil out of them. So how could you possibly say that kashim are forbidden to cut for any reason, even lahariachbo? Okay, so we're stuck. So what did they answer? Lo kasha ha-Rabbi Eliezer ha-Rabbanan. This is a source of debate between Tanaim. And now we're going to see Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan. If you remember, we saw them in our Mishnah, and that's how this Beitzah is going to start. The Mishnah was about if you already have a kesam that was already made, right? You have all these slivers in your garden or in your house. Are you allowed to take them to use them to clean your teeth? That's not the same thing, but we're starting with that. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, notel adam kesam mishel panav lachsot boshina. If you have one in your house, a little sliver of wood, take it and use it as a toothpick, no problem. They're not creating a utensil. The rabbis say this is different from what it says in our Mishnah. You can only take from an animal's trough because that was already designated for food, and therefore you can use it. It was already designated for use on Yantif, so you can use it as a toothpick to clean your teeth, but not if it was just laying around your house. It wasn't designated for anything. Vishavin, however, they both agree shelo yiktemenu, that you can't cut it to make a kesam, right? Ve'inktamo lachtzos bo shinav uliftoach bo adelet. If you did anyway, let's say you cut it to make a toothpick to clean your teeth or to open a door. Okay, somehow you use it to open your door. Bishogeg b'Shabbat chayav chatat. B'mizi b'yom tov sofeget ha'arba'im divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds, if you were to do this, it's forbidden by Torah law. Now, let's just take it one step farther. We'll see the Gemara. We'll say this in a minute. If it's forbidden by Torah law to cut it to create a utensil, then obviously we're going to say it's forbidden mid'Rabbanan, right, to do it lahariachbo, because once something's d'oraita, the rabbis had a reason to make a gzeira. There's something strange in the language here. If you notice, it says if you did it unwittingly on Shabbat, you bring a sacrifice, a korban chatat. And when it comes to Yantif, it talks about if you did it on purpose. It doesn't say what if you did it on purpose on Shabbat. So, and it says if you did it on purpose on Yantif, you would get lashes. Why does it say Shabbat shogeg and Yantif mezid? It seems a little bit strange. So one of the commentaries says, normally when people did things, they did them unwittingly. And therefore, most of the halachot, if you remember, Masechet Shabbat all the time, it would be chayav, and it would talk about chayav chatat, because it was all shogeg. What's the problem with Yantif? There is no korban shogeg. There's no, if you do something accidentally on Yantif, you don't get you're not liable for a korban chatat, because that's only something that you would get karet if you did it mezid and not Shabbat, but you don't get karet for Yantif, for malach on Yantif. So therefore, on Yantif, they have to mention what your punishment would be. There is only a punishment if you do it purposely, and therefore they only mention mezid. That's an aside. So the main point is that Rabbi Eliezer thinks that cutting it to create a utensil, if it's hard, is forbidden by Torah law. Therefore, the one who said it was usher holds by that. Okay, and that was the opinion we saw before, Rabbi Zera, who explained if it's kashet, then it's going to be forbidden by rabbinic law to cut it to smell. That's by Rabbi Eliezer. But Chachamim omrim echad zeh v'echad zeh eino ela mishum shvut. He thinks taking something hard and cutting it to make a utensil out of it is only forbidden by rabbinic law. If that's only forbidden by rabbinic law, then there's no reason to make a gzeira on that, because it's only rabbinic to begin with. And that would match the Mishnah Masechet Shabbat, which permitted breaking the utensil to get out the food, and not worried that that we should say no because maybe you'll open it to make a vessel out of it. And also the case of Rav Yehuda, who created, who cut these maklot and distributed them to people on Yantif, or maybe even on Shabbat. I'm not even sure. It doesn't matter because it's really the same. So that's their answer, and that resolves it. We're good. What's the problem, though? The problem is Rabbi Eliezer. So first, let's explain this. I already explained, but let's read it inside. Rabbi Eliezer deka'amar hatam chayav chatat, since he thinks it's forbidden mid'oraita to make the kli. Hacha patur v'lasur. When it comes to smell, to cut it to smell, he's going to forbid it by rabbinic law. Rabbanan deka'amar hatam patur v'lasur, but the rabbis only thought it was rabbinic. Hacha mutar lechatchila. Here they would say it's entirely permitted. The Lele, but wait, Lele the Rabbi Eliezer haditnan shover adam tachavit lechol mimenu gorgoru b'vat shelo yitkaven la'asok kli. But wait, Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is stated as one opinion. There's no machloket there. How could he disagree with the Mishnah Masechet Shabbat? Because he seems to say, I think it's asher midoraita, and therefore in terms of this, you shouldn't be able to break the kli. So what does he answer? And then, he would disagree. And that seems weird. So Amar Rav Ashi, and here comes the big line, halacha l'maaseh. Okay, you can look this up. Kitanya hahi b'mustiki. He explains that this didn't appear in Masechet Shabbat. He explains that this barrel that we're breaking is a barrel that's already had fallen apart and they glued it together. And it wasn't very solid. And therefore, he's not worried you're going to make a kli in this case. Here, we're not worried. If you're not intending to make a kli, we're not really worried you're going to make a kli out of this because it's not really worthy of making a new vessel out of it because it was broken. And therefore, he says, when it comes to a broken kli, there's no problem to open it. Why is this so interesting? Even though it's just Rabbi Elazar's opinion. First of all, there's different ways of understanding this. And for some reason, the Shulchan Aruch paskins, okay, there's a lot more to it. I'm giving you this really like just, they say in Hebrew, just a tip of what this sugya is about. Is that the Shulchan Aruch paskins, you're only allowed to open a barrel to get to the food inside, and which isn't just a barrel, we'll talk about other cases, if it's a mustiki. Only the way they describe it here. The way Rabbi Elazar understood the Mishnah, seemingly they say that's how we paskin, that only if it's mustiki are you allowed to open. And why? What's the relevance of this? So let's say cans, okay? You want to open a can of olives, a can of whatever it might be, a can of corn. Can you open it on Shabbos? Because you're, in essence, creating a kli, right? It wasn't really anything before, right? It was holding something, but it was sealed. You're opening it, you're creating a vessel. So it's like opening this barrel. So they say, so many of the commentaries think there's a whole big machloket about this. And some of the commentaries say this can that you're going to throw in the garbage is a mustiki, because mustiki doesn't only mean it was falling apart, but it's something that you're not planning to use in the permanent sense. So therefore, since it's not permanent, you're basically going to throw it out, and therefore it's not a problem. Again, there's a lot more to the sugya. I'm really just telling you a little bit of it, but that's, for example, something very relevant that comes out of our sugya. Why Rabbi Eliezer? Again, it seemed really weird because the rabbis seem to say not a problem at all. So there's all different explanations of why the Shulchan Aruch paskins that way. Anyway, it's a very famous, this mustiki is a very famous line here and used lahalacha, as I said. Okay. Umigabev min hachatzir. So now you can gather these slivers of wood from or slivers of straw from your courtyard. Remember, there was a machloket, can you or not? Tanu Rabbanit, megabev min hachatzir madlik, shekol ma shebachatzir muchanu, ubevad shelo tziburin tziburin. Anything in your courtyard is already considered mukhan, according to this source, this Beitzah, as long as you don't gather it into piles. For Rabbi Shimon Matir, Rabbi Shimon says you can even gather it into piles. So, what's the root of their machloket? Mar savar michzek de kamer chanef. It looks like you're gathering, when you make a pile, it looks like you're gathering for the next few days. So therefore they forbid it. And what about Rabbi Shimon who permits it? The fact that he's going to cook in another 5 minutes makes it clear that he's only gathering it for his fire right now. And it doesn't look like he's gathering it for tomorrow. Okay, why can't, now you would expect this is a very big topic. You would expect them to say a lot more about this. All they say is very simply, my time on mishum de kamoli biyom tov. Because you're creating something new on Yantif, right? You think about the fact that they say that there's a tradition that fire was created on Motzei Shabbat. That's what we light of candle at Havdalah, right? It's part of a creative act. And creative acts, right? It's not a malacha. There's no malacha called moli. We do have nolad, but nolad is a category of muktzah. That's something else. If something was born, you can't, right? You can't use it. But that's different. You're creating something new. So it's not exactly a malacha, but it's like a malacha because it's, right? The whole idea of melachot are not to be creative, not to create something like God created creation of the world and all that. So therefore, creating fire from nothing is forbidden because you're creating something new. However, transferring a fire from one place to another, that's allowed, again, for the purposes of cooking, etc. You can't heat up the rafim, the tiles of a roof, and cook on them. What's the problem? They're new that you've never used for cooking. Now, what might happen? They might burst. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So if you heat them up to basically then cook on them and they burst, then you basically heated it up for no reason whatsoever because they burst and you couldn't use them in the end for cooking. Some people say that what he said was because you need to first prepare them. What happens? Two processes happen when you light up a fire underneath these rafim, you heat them up. The first process is that you harden them and they become a kli. The second process is then they become hot and then you can use them. So that first part that happens when it becomes a kli, that's basically creating a utensil, and you can't do that. So since they're not ready as is, and while you heat them up, you're basically finalizing the final act, that's a problem. Whereas, that's so basically we have two answers to what exactly the problem is, and we'll stop here for today. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.